Hi everyone, thank you for joining us, Harley and I, as we catch the last vestiges of this beautiful winter afternoon sun. Welcome to chapter 6, which is called Paddington Recommended. Mrs. Brown tore open the first of the morning's mail, withdrew a large piece of white pasteboard, and then stared at it in amazement. "Good gracious," she exclaimed. "Fancy that! Mrs. Smith Comley is holding a Christmas ball in aid of the local children's hospital, and we've all been invited." Paddington peered across the table with a slice of toast and marmalade poised halfway to his mouth. "Mrs. Smith Comley's holding a Christmas ball," he repeated in great surprise. "I hope we get there before she drops it." "It isn't that sort of a ball, dear," said Mrs. Brown patiently. "It means she's having a dance," explained Judy. "Who's Mrs. Smith Comley when she's at home?" asked Mr. Brown. Mrs. Brown handed him the card. "Don't you remember Henry? Paddington met her when he was out carol singing last year. She's the one he cooked the baked elastic for by mistake." "Crikey," broke in Jonathan as he read the invitation. "She's either left it a bit late or it's been delayed in the post. It's tomorrow night." "And that's not all," added Mrs. Brown. "Have you seen what it says at the bottom?" Paddington hurried round the table and peered over Mr. Brown's shoulder. "RSVP!" he exclaimed. "No, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "RSVP. That simply means répondez, s'il vous plaît. It's French for reply, please." "You mean the bit about evening dress?" Mr. Brown looked around at Paddington, who was waving his toast and marmalade dangerously near his left ear. "Well, that's put the tin lid on it. I suppose we shall just have to say no." There was a note of relief in Mr. Brown's voice. He wasn't too keen on dancing at the best of times, and the thought of going to a ball with Mrs. Smith Comley filled him with gloom. But any hopes he'd entertained of using Paddington as an excuse were quickly dashed by the chorus of dismay which greeted his last remark. "I think we ought to try and arrange something, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "After all, it's in a very good cause. It's the same hospital Paddington collected for last year, and if it wasn't for him, we shouldn't be invited anyway." "We'll take him along to Heather and Sons and have him fitted out for the evening," said Mrs. Bird decidedly as she bustled around clearing out the breakfast things. "They hire out evening clothes, and it says in their advertisements they fit anyone while they wait." Mr. Brown eyed Paddington's figure doubtfully. "We need it tomorrow night," he said, "not next year." Paddington looked most upset at this last remark. It was bad enough writing things in initials, let alone French ones, but having to wear special clothes simply in order to dance seemed most complicated. However, he brightened considerably at the thought of going up to London to be fitted out, and when Mr. Brown, recognizing defeat at last, announced that he would meet them afterwards and take them all out to lunch as a special treat, he joined in the general excitement. Paddington liked visiting London, and he couldn't wait to get started, especially when Mr. Brown brought out his copy of a guide to good restaurants and began searching for a likely eating place. They have a restaurant at Heather's now," said Mrs. Brown. "We could combine the two things. It'll save a lot of trouble." Mr. Brown made a quick check. "It isn't a Duncan Hyde recommended," he said disappointedly. "He doesn't even mention it." "It only opened last week," replied Mrs. Brown, "so it wouldn't be, but not many people know about it yet, so at least it won't be crowded." "All right," said Mr. Brown, "you win." He snapped the book shut and handed it to Paddington. "Perhaps you can test a few of the dishes at lunchtime," he continued as the others hurried upstairs. "If they're any good, we'll send a recommendation to Mr. Hyde." "Thank you very much, Mr. Brown," said Paddington gratefully. He'd spent many happy hours browsing through the pages of Mr. Hyde's book, and he put it away carefully in the secret compartment of his suitcase while he got ready to go out. Duncan Hyde spent his time visiting restaurants all over the country, awarding them various shaped hats for their cooking, ranging from a very small beret for run-of-the-mill dishes to a giant-sized bowler hat for the very best, and some of the dishes he described were very mouth-watering indeed. Although no one had ever met him, for he preferred to remain anonymous, it was widely agreed that he must be a person of great taste, and when they arrived at Heather and Sons later that morning, Paddington peered through the restaurant window with interest in case there was anyone around carrying a hat. As they trooped through the main entrance, the Browns were greeted by a man in morning dress. "We'd like to fit this young bear out for a special occasion," said Mrs. Brown. "Can you direct us to the right department, please?" "Certainly, madame. Please step this way." With scarcely the flicker of an eyelid, the supervisor turned and led the way towards a nearby lift. "Does the young, gentleman have an appointment at Buckingham Palace?" he asked, glancing down at Paddington as the doors slid shut, "or is he simply going out?" "Neither," said Paddington, giving the man a hard stare. "I'm coming in." After the warmth of the underground, the air outside had struck particularly cold to his whiskers, and he didn't want to be sent out again. "He's going to a ball," explained Mrs. Brown hastily. "We want to hire some evening dress." "A ball?" The man looked slightly relieved. "One of the spring functions, no doubt," he remarked hopefully. "No," said Mrs. Bird firmly. "One of the Christmas ones. It's for tomorrow night, so there's no time to be lost." "It says in the advertisement you fit anyone," broke in Jonathan. "While you wait," added Judy imploringly. Yes," said the supervisor unhappily. He looked down at Paddington again. It's just that the young gentleman's legs are a bit, and we might have to do some drastic alterations if it's to be done from stock." "My legs are a bit, exclaimed Paddington hotly. He began giving the supervisor some very hard stares indeed, but fortunately the lift came to a stop before any more could be said. As the doors slid open and the man gave a discreet signal to an assistant hovering in the background, Mrs. Brown exchanged glances with the others. "I was wondering," she said, "if it wouldn't be better for the rest of us to carry on having trouble with my pages. Carry on with our Christmas shopping. We can all meet again in the restaurant downstairs at 1 o'clock. "A very good idea, madame." The supervisor sounded most relieved. "Rest assured," he continued as he ushered Paddington from the lift, "we will use our best endeavours and leave no stone unturned. I'll get our Mr. Stanley to look after the young gentleman. He does all our difficult cases, and there's nothing he likes better than a challenge." "That's as may be," said Mrs. Bird ominously as the gates slid shut again. "But I have a feeling he's going to have to turn over a few good stones before that bear's fitted out. You mark my words." The Browns' housekeeper didn't entirely approve of leaving Paddington to the tender mercies of Heather and Sons, impressive though their shop was. But as it happened, the supervisor's confidence in his staff was not misplaced, for no sooner had the Browns departed than everyone sprang into action. "I'll put Thimbles Martin on the job," announced Mr. Stanley, making notes as he circled Paddington with a tape measure. "He's the fastest man with a needle and thread in the business. He'll fix you up in no time at all." Looking suitably impressed, Paddington settled down to read his Duncan Hyde book while he waited. And indeed, it seemed only a very short while before Mr. Stanley reappeared, proudly carrying an immaculately pressed set of evening clothes. "You'll look a blade in these, and no mistake, sir," he exclaimed enthusiastically as he led Paddington into a changing cubicle. "Quite the young bear about town," agreed the supervisor. "Mind you," he continued, allowing himself a smile of satisfaction as he helped Paddington on with the jacket, "you'll have to watch your P's and Q's. There's no knowing who you might not get mistaken for dressed like that. Will you be taking them with you, or shall we send them?" Paddington examined his reflection in the mirror, or rather, since there were mirrors on all four walls, what seemed like a never-ending line of reflections stretching away into the distance. Although he felt very pleased to get his evening dress so quickly, he was looking forward even more to the thought of carrying out Mr. Brown's suggestion and investigating some dishes for the guide. "I think," he announced at last, "I'll wear them, thank you very much." And disregarding the anxious expressions he was leaving behind, he picked up his belongings and headed for the lift. As Mrs. Brown had forecast, not many people knew about Heather's restaurant, and what with that and the early hour, it was still practically empty when Paddington entered. Just inside the door there was an enormous sweet trolley, and his eyes nearly popped out with astonishment as he took in the various items. There were so many different shapes, sizes, and colours, he soon lost count, and it was while he was on his paws and knees examining the mounds of chocolate mousse and the oceans of fruit salads on the bottom shelf that he suddenly realized someone was talking to him. "May I be of assistance?" asked one of the waiters. Paddington stood up and raised his hat politely. "No, thank you very much," he said sadly. "I was only looking." Holding up the Duncan Hyde book, he ran his eye over the trolley again. "I was hoping I might be able to do some testing later on. I think some of your dishes might be worth a bowler." To Paddington's surprise, his words seemed to have a magical effect on the waiter. "Pardon me, sir," he exclaimed, jumping to attention. "I didn't realize who you were. If you care just to wait just one moment, sir, I'll call the manager." Bowing low as he backed away, the man disappeared from view, only to return a moment later accompanied by an imposing figure dressed in a black coat and striped trousers. "I can't tell you," boomed the second man, rubbing his hands with invisible soap, "how delighted we are that you've decided to honor us with your presence. It's just what our restaurant needs." Taking in Paddington's dress suit, hat, and whiskers, he gave a knowing wink at the book. "I see you've been hiding your light under a bushel." "I have?" exclaimed Paddington, looking more and more surprised at the turn the conversation was taking. "We'll put you in the window, sir," announced the manager, leading the way across the floor. "We have some very special dishes on today," he confided with another wink, as he helped Paddington into a chair. "I'm sure we can find something to titillate your palate." "I expect you can," said Paddington politely, giving the man a wink in return, "but I'm not sure if I can afford them." "My dear sir," the man raised his hands in mock horror as he whisked the menu away. "We don't want to bother ourselves with mere money." "Don't we?" exclaimed Paddington excitedly. The manager shook his head. "You need only sign the bill," he explained. "Let's think about food first. That's much more important. We want you to feel perfectly at home." "Oh, I do already," said Paddington, grasping his knife and fork. "When can I start?" "That's what I like to see," replied the manager, beaming all over his face. "Well," he continued, rubbing his hands in anticipation, "I can certainly recommend our avocado pear filled with sea-fresh prawns and cream sauce. After that," he said, "may I suggest either pot-fresh lobster, Dover-fresh sole, farm-fresh escalope of veal, or oven-fresh steak and kidney pudding?" All the talk of food was beginning to make Paddington feel hungry, and it didn't take him long to make up his mind. "I think I'd like to try some of each," he announced rashly. If the manager was surprised, he concealed his feelings remarkably well. In fact, a look of respect came over his face as he handed Paddington's order to a waiter who was hovering nearby. "I must say," he remarked, "you take your job very seriously, sir. There aren't many people in your position who would take the trouble to try everything on the menu." "Would you care to test one of our rare old wines?" Paddington thought for a moment. "I think I'd sooner test some of your tin-fresh cocoa," he said. "Tin-fresh cocoa?" For one brief moment, the manager's calm seemed to desert him. Then he brightened. "I have a feeling you're trying to catch us out," he said, wagging his finger roguishly. "Perhaps," he added, waving to the direction of the trolley, "you would care to contemplate the sweets over the cheese?" Paddington gave him an odd look. "I'd sooner eat them," he said, "but I think I'd better leave a little bit of room. I'm having lunch with someone at 1:00. A look of renewed admiration came over the man's face. "Well," he said, bowing his way out as the first of the dishes began to arrive, "I leave you to your task, but I do hope you'll see fit to mention us when the time comes." "Oh, yes," replied Paddington earnestly. "I shall tell all my friends." Paddington still wasn't sure why he was being treated in such a royal manner, but he wasn't the sort of bear to look a gift horse in the mouth, and as everyone obviously wanted him to enjoy his meal, he was only too willing to oblige. Already, quite a large crowd had gathered on the pavement outside Heather's. In fact, the window was black with faces, and it was getting darker with every passing moment. Paddington's every move was watched with increasing interest, and as he settled down to his gargantuan meal, the applause which greeted each new course was exceeded only by the one which followed. But if the vast majority of the audience viewed the goings-on inside the restaurant with wonder and delight, there were 5 newly joined members who stood watching with horror and dismay on their faces. The Browns had managed to meet outside the shop, but like most of the other passers-by, they had been drawn to the crowd gathered around the window, and now as they pushed their way to the front, their worst fears were realized. "Mercy me!" cried Mrs. Bird. "What on earth is that bear up to now?" "I don't know what he's up to," said Mr. Brown gloomily as a loud groan rose from the audience, "but whatever it is, I think it's coming to an end." A sudden change had indeed taken place on the other side of the glass, and the Browns watched with sinking hearts. It all began when a waiter arrived bearing a large sheet of folded paper on a plate. Handing Paddington a pen, he stood over him with a deferential smile on his face while he signed his name. Then gradually the smile disappeared, only to be replaced by an expression which the Browns didn't like the look of at all. "Come on," cried Judy, grabbing her mother's arm. "We'd better do some rescuing." "Oh, Lord," cried Mr. Brown as they pushed their way back into the crowd. "Here we go again." Unaware that help was on its way, Paddington stared at the waiter as if he could hardly believe his eyes, let alone his ears. £80.62, he exclaimed, "just for a meal?" "Not just for a meal," said the waiter, eyeing all the stains. "About 10 meals, if you ask me. We thought you were Duncan Hyde, the famous gourmet." Paddington nearly fell backwards off his chair at the news. "Duncan Hyde, the famous gourmet," he repeated. "I'm not Duncan Hyde. I'm Paddington Brown from Dark's Prue, and I'm a bear." "In that case," said the waiter, handing back the bill, "I'm afraid it's cash. It includes the cover charge," he added meaningly, "but not the tip." "A cover charge?" exclaimed Paddington hotly. "Well, I didn't even have one. It was all open." He peered at the piece of paper in his paw. £10.70 for a Bombay surprise? That's all part of the surprise, replied the waiter nastily. Well, I've got one for you, said Paddington. I've only got 20p. Paddington felt most upset about the whole affair, especially as he hadn't intended eating in the first place. Apart from putting his signature on the bill, as he'd been asked, he'd even added his special paw print to show it was genuine. And he looked very relieved when he caught sight of the Browns heading in his direction. Since he'd arrived, a great change had come over the restaurant, and it was now full, almost to overflowing. The Browns had to weave a tortuous path in and out of the other diners, and before they were able to reach Paddington's table, they found their way barred by the manager. "Does this young gentleman belong to you?" he asked, pointing in Paddington's direction. Why do you ask the question?" queried Mr. Brown, playing for time. "Henry!" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "How could you?" "I've never seen him before either, Mr. Brown," called Paddington, entering into the spirit of things. Mr. Brown heaved a deep sigh as he reached for his wallet. "Since you ask," he said, "I'm afraid he does." "Afraid?" The manager stared at the Browns. "Did you say afraid?" He waved an all-embracing hand around the restaurant. "Why, this is the best thing that's happened to us since we opened. That young bear's attracted so many new customers, we don't know whether we're coming or going. There's certainly no charge." He turned back to Paddington. "I wish we could have you sitting in the window every day of the week. You may not be Duncan Hyde, but you're certainly worth your weight in lobster soufflé." The manager broke off and looked at Paddington with concern. For some reason or other, his words seemed to be having a strange effect. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. "Your whiskers seem to have gone a very funny colour. Let me help you up. Perhaps you'd like to try some of our bean-fresh coffee with cream?" Paddington gave another groan. If he'd had to make a list of his needs at that moment, getting up would have figured very low, while food and drink would have been lucky to get a mention at all. Dropping his guidebook, he sank back into the chair and felt for the buttons on his jacket. "I'd rather not do any more testing today, thank you very much," he gasped. Apart from all his other troubles, Paddington had noticed a rather ominous tearing sound whenever he moved, and although he'd minded his peas during lunch, he had a feeling that both Mr. Stanley and Thimbles Martin were in for a very busy afternoon dealing with his cues. All the same, he had to admit he'd never had quite such a meal in his life before. "I think," he announced, "that if I were a food tester, I would award Heathers one of my uncle's hats." Mr. Brown smacked his lips in anticipation. "It must be good then," he said, reaching for the menu. "I shall enjoy my lunch. After all," he continued, amid general agreement, "one of Paddington's hats must be worth a whole wardrobe full of Duncan Hyde's bowlers any day of the week."